and nobody wants anything that I don't want. They don't want to take anything away from me. They just want the same things I want.
For decades, the Doobie Brothers were the soundtrack of American rock. Harmonies that felt timeless, grooves that seemed unstoppable. From smoky bar gigs to stadium anthems, they built a career few could rival, crafting hits that defined the sound of the 70s and beyond. To the public, they were a brotherhood, bound by music and success. But behind the curtain, their story was far more complicated, marked by clashes of ego, sudden departures, and moments that nearly shattered the band forever. Fans have always suspected there was more to the story, whispers that the official narrative left untold, and now, the question echoes louder than ever. Have you heard what really happened to the Doobie Brothers? The truth isn't what fans expect, and once revealed, it rewrites the band's legacy in ways that no one saw coming. The 1970s were an era of reinvention in American music. Rock was no longer a single unified force. It was splintering, fragmenting, and reshaping itself into 100 different directions. Psychedelia, the defining sound of the late 60s, was fading into the background. Country rock was on the rise, with bands like the Eagles riding its clean harmonies and desert imagery straight to superstardom. Funk was seeping into everything, bringing rhythm and groove into corners of rock where it had never existed before. And as disco quietly emerged from underground clubs, the musical landscape grew even more unpredictable. Audiences were restless, tastes were shifting, and no band could survive by standing still. Out of this chaos rose a group few expected to last, let alone dominate: the Doobie Brothers. From the very beginning, they defied easy categorization. They weren't the Eagles, with their carefully crafted California polish and slick radio-ready harmonies. They weren't Santana, driven by fiery, Latin-infused guitar wizardry. They weren't the Allman Brothers, steeped in Southern rock and extended improvisations. Instead, the Doobies carved out their own lane, somewhere in the fertile middle ground. They blended rock's grit with soul's warmth, layered it with rhythms that drew from funk and R&B, and topped it off with harmonies that were rougher, earthier, and somehow more approachable than the pristine polish of their contemporaries. In doing so, they became one of the most versatile and beloved acts of their time. In the early days, the band's identity was defined by Tom Johnston, whose voice and guitar carried the spirit of a man who had cut his teeth in smoky bars and long nights of jamming. Johnston's songs were raw and unapologetic, the sound of a group that was closer to a biker gang than a polished pop act. Tracks like Listen to the Music in China Grove embodied that energy, loud, muscular, and alive with the restless pulse of the open road. Fans responded immediately. The Doobies weren't pretending to be anything other than what they were: a band of outsiders who stumbled into success through sheer grit, determination, and an undeniable knack for catchy hooks. But even as the success rolled in, something else began to take root. Beneath the surface, beyond the screaming crowds and sold-out tours, the Doobie Brothers were never just a single-minded group chasing fame. They were a collection of strong personalities, each with their own vision of what the band should sound like, what direction it should move in, and ultimately, what kind of legacy they wanted to leave. That underlying tension, mostly invisible to fans at the time, would become the foundation of the Doobie Brothers' story. Every member brought with them not just talent, but ambition. And when you place that many ambitious, creative forces into the same room, sparks are inevitable. To the audience, the Doobie Brothers projected the image of a brotherhood, a united front of musicians who seemed to play as one. But behind the curtain, the reality was far more complicated. It wasn't always about unity. It was about compromise, about competing visions, about quiet disagreements that were never fully resolved. The irony was that this very tension helped shape their music. The Doobies weren't a band that coasted on a single formula. Their sound evolved constantly, each album carrying traces of the tug-of-war happening behind the scenes. Every time they leaned one way or another, toward gritty rock, toward smooth soul, toward polished pop, it reflected not just creative growth, but the push and pull of voices fighting to define the band's future. And as much as their success carried them upward, it also carried the seeds of their eventual turmoil. The bigger they became, the more those tensions grew. Platinum records and packed arenas only heightened the stakes, magnifying every disagreement, every clash of vision. What began as a scrappy group of outsiders chasing a dream soon became one of the most complicated stories in rock history. For fans, the Doobie Brothers were a soundtrack of joy. Music to dance to, music to sing along with, music that seemed effortless. But the truth was far from effortless. Behind every harmony was a negotiation. Behind every hit song was a compromise. The so-called brotherhood that audiences adored was held together not by unshakable unity, but by fragile, shifting alliances. And while no one could see it yet, the very thing that made them great, their versatility, their adaptability, their willingness to reinvent themselves, was also the thing that would eventually pull them apart. The Doobie Brothers weren't just writing hits. They were building a legacy wrapped in conflict, compromise, and quiet betrayals. And that legacy, as brilliant as it was, would one day come crashing down under the weight of its own contradictions. On stage, the Doobie Brothers projected nothing but unity. A wall of harmonies, guitars, and rhythm that felt unstoppable. A sonic force that washed over audiences and convinced them this was a brotherhood in the truest sense of the word. To fans, the image was clear. A group of friends bound together by music, moving as one, each member contributing to a greater whole. The roar of applause and the sheer energy of their shows seemed to confirm it. But like so many bands of the 1970s, what the audience saw was a carefully curated illusion. Offstage, the brotherhood was far more fragile. Behind the curtain, it wasn't a simple story of camaraderie. It was a balancing act of egos, insecurities, and competing ambitions, each one threatening to topple the unity fans took for granted. The Doobie Brothers had always been a band built on contrasts, and those contrasts didn't disappear when the spotlight turned off. If anything, the pressures of fame magnified them. At the center of it all was Tom Johnston. With his confident swagger, gritty vocals, and hard-driving guitar, Johnston was the natural frontman, the face and sound of the early Doobie Brothers. His songs, full of energy and bite, gave the band its first identity, one rooted in rock tradition but tinged with enough rhythm to make it unique. But being the frontman came with a heavy burden. Success didn't just mean recognition, it meant responsibility. It meant control. And control was something no one in the Doobie Brothers was willing to hand over lightly. Patrick Simmons stood as a counterbalance. Unlike Johnston's brash, high-octane energy, Simmons brought a quieter presence, a thoughtful songwriter whose introspective ballads revealed another side of the band's character. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he didn't need to be. His songs spoke for him, offering a depth and sensitivity that gave the Doobies' catalog its texture. Simmons wasn't interested in wrestling for dominance, but even his gentle influence added weight to the band's internal tug-of-war. For every gritty anthem Johnston pushed forward, Simmons countered with something smoother, subtler, and more reflective. It wasn't just a matter of who sang lead or who wrote the hits. The real struggle was about direction. The Doobies were at a crossroads. Should they stay rooted in the muscular, guitar-driven rock that had carried them out of clubs and onto stadium stages? Or should they lean further into experimentation, exploring smoother sounds, funkier rhythms, and more polished arrangements? The very versatility that made the band appealing also sowed confusion. Every step toward evolution raised questions about loyalty and identity. Were they expanding their sound or abandoning it? The brotherhood that fans adored was, in truth, a fragile truce. The grind of the road only made things worse. Touring was relentless. Long nights, endless travel, and little rest. The spotlight, which had once been a dream, became an unrelenting burden. And behind hotel doors and tour bus curtains, arguments erupted. Arguments that would never be spoken of publicly. Some members longed for stability, eager to preserve the formula that had already brought them success. Others craved change, restless to push into uncharted musical territory before the band grew stale. Caught between these opposing forces was a growing tension that stretched far beyond the usual disagreements of creative people. The Doobie Brothers were no longer just a band of friends. They were a brand, a business, and every choice carried enormous stakes. The smallest decisions, what single to release, which song made it onto an album, who sang which verse, became battlegrounds. And yet, to the fans, nothing seemed amiss. The records kept selling, the tours kept filling seats. The music never faltered. But underneath, the cracks were widening. What had begun as a group of friends bound by music was slowly transforming into something far more precarious. A house built on shifting ground. The unity that looked so solid under stage lights was already fragile. And when the pressure finally pushed too hard, those cracks would break wide open. And when they did, the fallout wouldn't just change the Doobie Brothers. It would ripple outward, altering the shape of rock history itself. Every band has that one song, the track that doesn't just climb the charts, but reshapes the entire course of their career. For the Doobie Brothers, that song was Black Water. What began as a playful experiment, almost tossed into the mix as a curiosity, became their first #1 hit and forever changed the way the band was seen by the world and by themselves. The story of Black Water didn't begin with a grand plan. It was Patrick Simmons's creation, a finger-picked tune he had been carrying quietly in his back pocket, one that drew on his love of southern rhythms and swampy imagery. In an era when the Doobies were mostly associated with the driving rock anthems of Tom Johnston, the song felt almost like an outlier. Acoustic, laid back, tinged with country and R&B, it was a track that could easily have been overlooked. For a while, it nearly was. When the band first recorded it, Black Water wasn't even considered single material. The focus was on Johnston's hard-charging rockers, songs that had already proven they could dominate radio and pack stadiums. Simmons's tune was relegated to the B-side of another release, quietly tucked away where no one expected it to make much noise. But music has a way of finding its own destiny. Radio DJs started flipping the record, spinning Black Water instead of the intended A-side. Listeners responded immediately. The swampy groove, the haunting harmonies, and the sing-along chorus struck a chord that transcended genre. Suddenly, a song the band had treated almost as an afterthought was climbing the charts with unstoppable momentum. By March 1975, Black Water hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, giving the Doobie Brothers their first chart-topping single. For fans, it was confirmation of the band's versatility, the proof that they could be more than just a rock act. The song blended elements of country, folk, and R&B into something both nostalgic and fresh. and its charm was undeniable. Audiences couldn't get enough. The Doobies were no longer just a successful band. They were cemented as one of the defining acts of the decade. But success, as always, is a double-edged sword. On the surface, Black Water represented triumph. But inside the band, it sparked something far more complicated. The record label, thrilled with the unexpected hit, demanded more of the same. They wanted more experimentation, more genre bending, more crossover tracks that could replicate the magic of Simmons's creation. The pressure shifted the dynamic within the group. For Tom Johnston, the Doobies' original frontman and creative engine, the rise of Black Water was unsettling. His gritty, guitar-driven rock had built the band's reputation, and suddenly, it felt like that identity was slipping away. Johnston worried that the Doobies' hard edge was being smoothed over in favor of softer, more eclectic sounds. To him, the heart of the band was at risk of being buried under polish and experimentation. Patrick Simmons, meanwhile, felt vindicated. His quieter style, long overshadowed by Johnston's firepower, was now at the center of the band's success. For Simmons, the possibilities seemed endless. If a song like Black Water could top the charts, then perhaps the Doobie Brothers weren't confined to one lane after all. They could explore, experiment, and evolve without limits. And just beyond the horizon loomed another figure who would take those possibilities even further: Michael McDonald. His entrance into the Doobie Brothers would transform the band in ways no one could have predicted, pushing them deeper into soul and R&B influences. To some, McDonald would become the band's savior. To others, he would be the wedge that drove them apart. Looking back, Black Water wasn't just a hit song. It was the crack in the dam, the moment when competing visions within the Doobie Brothers began to surface with greater urgency. The success united them in triumph, but divided them in purpose. Fans only saw the joy of a #1 single. Inside the band, it raised questions that could never truly be answered. The legacy of Black Water is still debated decades later. Was it the song that elevated the Doobie Brothers to greatness? Or was it the turning point that signaled the end of the original brotherhood, setting them on a path of reinvention and internal conflict? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that Black Water changed everything. It gave Patrick Simmons a new voice in the band. It shifted the expectations of their audience, and it opened the door for a transformation so profound that even today, fans still ask the question, what really happened to the Doobie Brothers after Black Water? The public saw a band at the height of its powers, selling out arenas, stacking gold records, and embodying the dream of a rock and roll brotherhood. But behind closed doors, the story was far more volatile. The long nights on the road, endless recording sessions, and mounting pressures of fame had begun to strip away the camaraderie. The cracks that once seemed small now threatened to split the band apart. Arguments about set lists turned into shouting matches. Disagreements over song direction escalated into standoffs that lasted days. Johnston's insistence on holding on to the band's rock and roll edge clashed with others' desire to experiment. Some members leaned toward softer, more soulful influences. Others clung to the band's original grit. The unity that had carried them through the early years was slipping through their fingers. It wasn't just the music. The rock lifestyle had its grip on them. Late nights fueled by substances, exhaustion, and the toll of stardom. Health scares loomed, and so did resentments. As one insider put it, what looked like a brotherhood on stage was sometimes a war zone off it. The fights didn't always end in explosions. Sometimes they ended in silence. Weeks could pass without certain members speaking directly to one another, even as they stood shoulder to shoulder in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. The image of brotherhood had become a mask, one they wore well enough to fool the world, but not themselves. The Doobie Brothers weren't just fighting for their music, they were fighting for their very survival as a band. And just when it seemed they might not hold together, fate stepped in with a twist no one saw coming. Fame is intoxicating, but it is also cruel. For the Doobie Brothers, success magnified everything: their talents, their flaws, and most dangerously, their rivalries. What had begun as a band of friends playing for the love of music had transformed into a business empire, one with millions of dollars at stake and a legion of fans hanging on every note. That kind of pressure breeds rivals. Johnston's dominance as the band's original frontman created tension with those who felt their contributions were overlooked. Patrick Simmons, once the quiet mediator, found himself caught between loyalty and ambition. Even Jeff Baxter, whose technical genius had elevated the band's sound, began clashing with others over creative direction. Success had brought them everything they once dreamed of, but it came at a cost. Trust was eroding. Resentment simmered just below the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. And the spark came in the form of new music. As the band pushed to reinvent themselves, members took sides: rock traditionalists versus musical explorers. The label loved the experimentation. Some fans embraced it. Others longed for the hard-driving edge of the early days. Inside the band, the debate wasn't just about sound. It was about identity, control, and the fear of being left behind. Friends had become competitors, rivals, and the brothers were no longer united by love of music alone, but bound together by contracts, obligations, and the heavy chains of fame. The Doobie Brothers were more successful than ever, but at the cost of the very thing that had brought them together. And in the middle of this storm, one man's arrival would change everything forever. When Michael McDonald joined the Doobie Brothers, he was supposed to be a temporary fix. Tom Johnston's health struggles had left the band in need of a voice, and McDonald, with his smooth, soulful tone, seemed the perfect choice. But what began as a stopgap quickly turned into a revolution. McDonald's voice didn't just fit the Doobie Brothers' sound, it redefined it. Songs like "Taking It to the Streets" and later "What a Fool Believes" propelled the band into a new era, blending rock with R&B and jazz in ways they had never dared before. Critics praised the transformation. Fans flocked to the concerts. The band was more successful than ever. But not everyone saw McDonald's arrival as a blessing. For Johnston, sidelined by illness, it was a bitter pill. His band, the one he had helped build from the ground up, was suddenly carrying on without him. And worse, thriving in a way that didn't sound like the Doobie Brothers he knew. Some members embraced McDonald's artistry. Others resented the shift, seeing it as the end of the band's original identity. The fallout was quiet but devastating. Friendships strained, loyalties fractured. The Doobie Brothers had gained a new voice but lost something just as important: unity. McDonald's arrival saved the band from collapse, but in doing so, it also created a rift that would define the rest of their history. The Doobie Brothers were no longer just the band fans had known. They were something else entirely. And that transformation came with consequences that still echo today. Jeff "Skunk" Baxter was never just another guitarist. He was a force, a brilliant, unpredictable musician whose technical mastery gave the Doobie Brothers a sharper edge. His solos were daring, his ideas innovative, and his presence undeniable. But genius often walks hand in hand with conflict. And in Baxter's case, his vision for the band clashed head-on with where others wanted to go. As Michael McDonald's influence grew, the Doobie Brothers' sound softened into soulful ballads and jazz-infused harmonies. To many, it was evolution. To Baxter, it was betrayal. He had joined the band to play fiery guitar-driven rock, not smooth R&B. In private, he voiced his frustrations, warning that the group was abandoning its roots. But in the whirlwind of success, his protests often fell on deaf ears. The breaking point came quietly, without fanfare. One day he was there, the next he was gone. Officially, it was called a creative split. Unofficially, it was a fracture, deep, personal, and bitter. For fans, Baxter's absence was a shock. For the band, it was a necessary sacrifice. But among insiders, whispers persisted. Baxter hadn't just left the band. He'd been pushed out. The unspoken betrayal lingered long after his departure. The Doobie Brothers moved forward, but the shadow of what was lost hung over them. To this day, Baxter's exit is remembered not just as a lineup change, but as one of the great turning points in the band's saga, when loyalty was tested and the meaning of brotherhood was forever redefined. By the early 1980s, the Doobie Brothers were exhausted. The constant touring, the creative battles, the changing lineups, it all took its toll. In 1982, they called it quits. For fans, it felt like the end of an era, the closing of a book that had defined a decade of music. But if the Doobie Brothers taught the world anything, it was that endings can be temporary. The comeback began slowly. In the late 80s, the band reunited for what was meant to be a one-off tour. Nostalgia was powerful, but the response was overwhelming. Fans who had grown up with China Grove listened to the music and What a Fool Believes packed stadiums. Proving the Doobies weren't just a relic of the past, they were still a force to be reckoned with. But this was not the same band of the 70s. They were older, wiser, and more cautious. Old rivalries hadn't vanished, but they were tempered by time. Johnston returned, Simmons remained steady, and McDonald appeared intermittently, his presence still a lightning rod of controversy. The comeback wasn't seamless. It was messy, complicated, and fragile. But it was real. For a band that had burned itself out in the fires of fame, the revival was nothing short of miraculous. The Doobie Brothers weren't just surviving, they were thriving again. And with every new tour, every new reunion, fans were reminded that what they had wasn't just music, it was a legacy. For decades, the Doobie Brothers carried an image of unity, brothers bound by music, triumph, and survival. But beneath that image, there were always secrets. Stories whispered among crew members, arguments never spoken of outside studio walls, rivalries that never fully healed. The truth is, the Doobie Brothers' story is not just one of success. It's one of struggle, sacrifice, and silence. Johnston's resentment of McDonald's rise, Baxter's bitter departure, the toll of fame on friendships. These weren't just bumps in the road. They were wounds that shaped the band forever. And as time passed, some of those secrets began to slip into the open. In interviews, members cautiously admitted to the conflicts. Biographers hinted at betrayals. Fans pieced together the puzzle. The Doobie Brothers may have played the role of family for the cameras, but behind the scenes, it was often anything but. Yet perhaps that's what makes their story so compelling. They weren't perfect, they weren't always united, but through it all, they made music that connected across generations. The very conflicts that nearly tore them apart also fueled the creativity that made them legendary. The secrets may never all be revealed, but enough has surfaced to make one thing clear. The Doobie Brothers' legacy is as much about survival as it is about harmony. The Doobie Brothers' journey was never a straight line. It was a saga of soaring triumphs and devastating fractures, of harmonies that masked discord, and of friendships tested by fame. To the outside world, they were a band of brothers whose music carried joy, groove, and timeless appeal. But behind the curtain, the truth was far more complicated. What really happened to the Doobie Brothers? The answer lies in the collision of ambition and artistry. Tom Johnston's raw, driving rock spirit clashed with Michael McDonald's silky, soulful reinvention. Jeff Baxter's brilliance became too volatile to contain. Patrick Simmons found himself the reluctant glue, holding together a group that seemed destined to tear itself apart. Each man carried his own vision, his own scars, and his own definition of what the band should be. At its core, the Doobie Brothers' story is about survival. They weren't supposed to last. Too many egos, too many battles, too many exits. And yet, decade after decade, they endured. They fell apart, only to rebuild. They clashed, only to reconcile. They reinvented themselves, not once, but many times, each era leaving its mark on the band's identity. The truth is not a single revelation, but a tapestry of betrayal and loyalty, of grudges and forgiveness, of secrets carried for years. The Doobie Brothers were never just a band. They were a family in the truest sense. Messy, flawed, broken at times, but bound together by something larger than themselves. In the end, what really happened to the Doobie Brothers is this. They became legends not because they were perfect, but because they weren't. Their story, with all its chaos, gave the world music that endures, songs that still fill car radios, concert halls, and memories. And for fans, that's the truth that matters most. If brotherhood is more than a name, why do so many stories remain untold? The Doobie Brothers built a legacy of timeless songs, yet what really happened behind the scenes is far less simple. Before nostalgia smooths out the rough edges, remember, some legacies deserve to be questioned. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.